Hello, my name is Allen Hoffman. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. The purpose of this video is to explain some basic concepts of stress analysis and then to apply those concepts to a real device. So, what we're going to do first is talk about some basic ideas and concepts about stresses. There are two important concepts about stresses. Stresses are always calculated at a point in an object. Now, the same stress may exist at a number of points in an object, but nonetheless the calculation is always at a point. And the stresses that act at a point always depend upon the plane orientation of the plane on which they act. So we're going to go into this in more detail in the first part of this video. The first step in calculating stresses is to draw a correct free body diagram of the object. And so we're going to start out with the simplest type of object that can be held in equilibrium, namely a two-force member. If I take this pen as an example of the member, if I push on the two ends, I'll place the member in compression, and the forces at each end must be equal and opposite in order to satisfy force equilibrium. Similarly, if I have a bolt here and I pull on each end, the stresses are based upon forces which pull on the bolt and therefore place the member in tension. If I get far enough away from the point of application of the forces, I can assume that the force is evenly distributed over the cross-section of the area, whether it's in tension or whether it's in compression. Stress therefore on a plane perpendicular to the member, if I'm pulling on it, will be tensile and will be calculated as the force in the member divided by the cross-sectional area. Now, on the other hand, if I change the orientation of the plane, that is, instead of thinking of the bolt being cut along a plane perpendicular to its axis, I cut it along a slant plane, then nonetheless I still have to equilibrate those two forces. So the net force on that slant plane is the same as on really any plane that I cut through the bolt. However, when I go to calculate the stresses on that plane, I now have that force, that axial force, distributed over a smaller area, and therefore the stresses, in looking at a free body diagram, I have forces to equilibrate the axial force. I have a force perpendicular to the plane, assuming the slant plane is this way. I have a force this way, and a shear force on the plane that goes along the surface of the plane. So therefore, even though I have the same force acting on the object in the axial sense, I now have two components of stress. One is perpendicular to the plane, which we call normal stresses, and that's the force perpendicular to the plane divided by the area of cross-sectional area of the plane, not of the object. And similarly, the shear stress is defined as the force parallel to the plane, in this case, divided by the area, the cross-sectional area in shear. So, depending on how I cut the object, depending on the plane that's passing through the very same point, I can have only normal stresses for a plane like this, and I can have normal and shear stresses acting on a plane like that. And we can carry this further into the analysis of materials by looking at the fact that if we think of simple ways in which materials fail, materials may fail either due to exceeding the maximum normal stress or exceeding the maximum shear stress. So even though we think of this as uniaxial, we can have shear stresses on any plane except the plane that's perpendicular to the axis. So that really takes care of uniaxial loading. The next type of loading I'd like to briefly describe is one in which we have bending. So this would be the case of a beam rigidly affixed to a wall, and I put a load on it in the vertical direction. Now, it's apparent from equilibrium in the vertical direction that over here by my hand, I must also have an equal and opposite force in the vertical direction, in this case pointing up. However, if we look at putting the load here, I have the equal and opposite force going up, but I also have to exert a moment using my hand to equilibrate the moment, which in this case is clockwise, caused by loading here. We can decompose this into, using free body diagrams, into a free body diagram at a general location in which the plane at which the object is cut, it has obviously a shear stress to counteract the downward force, but it also has to, that plane, the stresses on that plane have to exert a net moment, which means therefore that the stresses are not, the normal stresses are not, rather than being constant across the cross section, they vary with the position of the point in the cross section, and on the upper half of the object are tensile stresses, on the lower half are compressive stresses. And therefore that illustrates the second point, that stresses vary with position, and the original point, the stresses vary with the orientation of the plane. So that concludes pretty much the first phase of what we want to cover in the video, and we'll move on to looking at how we might calculate stresses in a real object. Usually the objects found in textbooks on stress analysis are highly idealized, and so what we're going to do here is look at a real object and make some observations about how you might calculate the stresses. So what we have here is a simple device. This is a bottle capper, and it's used to put caps on bottles. Nowadays, in earlier times, it was used in an agrarian society. It was used in the home to cap bottles of maybe root beer or other things that were grown or processed in the home. Nowadays, the market for this type of device is really to cap bottles of beer produced by home brewers. So how this object operates is very simple. It's a relatively easy device, and what it does is it takes the crown, which is essentially the bottle cap, and the crown is placed on the bottle capper is placed over it, drops down over it, and then the operator grabs the bottle capper like this and squeezes it. Now, if I go further, at this point I've just aligned everything. If I bring it down to the horizontal position, then I will put the cap on the bottle. But I'm going to refrain from doing that. So this is a relatively, retrieve my bottle cap. This is a relatively simple device. It's got which we're going to use to think about and calculate stresses. So you can see it's a mechanism. The first thing we would have to do is draw a free body diagram of whatever parts we want to calculate stresses in. Draw the correct free body diagram, of course. If we draw the incorrect free body diagram, our stress calculations, of course, will be wrong. So I'm going to illustrate a couple of parts of this this bottle capper. Namely, I've disassembled it, and I'm going to look at the handle, and then I'm going to look at the link that shows right here. So there's the real object, and here's a similar bottle capper in which I've made some modifications so that I can disassemble it. You see the nuts and bolts instead of the pins. And I'm going to concentrate on the two parts on this side of the bottle capper. So you can see what I've taken apart here. And what I have here are three different objects. I have the handle. Now the handle has two holes in it, which are in, and I've replaced the pins with a long screw, long bolt. So when we look at the parts here, the handle is pivoted at this point, right there, and then the handle is connected to this link right here, which is also here by another bolt, and it is connected by these two links. So let's start with some of the simpler parts, or a simpler part. The links can only have forces applied at 2 points. So they are indeed a two-force, they both are one on each side. They both are two-force members, and therefore the line, if we pull on them, I'm going to put the screws down here on the table and pull on them, that the forces acting along the tabletop, in the direction along the tabletop, have to act through the two holes, and they have to be equal, opposite, and collinear. So this link is essentially, when I go to cap the bottle, is in tension, just like the first example that I gave you in this video. So therefore, we could calculate the normal stress in the link by measuring its cross-sectional area and then taking the force and dividing it by that cross-sectional area, and that would be the stress, and it would be acted on axially along the line that connects the two holes. Now, of course, this is not in a uniform. This does not have uniform cross-section, so the stresses vary with position here. And also, if we looked at the stresses on a slant plane, like the first example, we would find we would have normal stresses and shear stresses on a slant plane in this device, even though it's a two-force member. The next member we'll look at is the handle. Of course, the handle has two pivot points. We'll drop the nuts in between here. And so we can have a variety of stresses here depending on how it's loaded. Now, it's most heavily loaded when it's essentially in this position and the links are connected up to here. So they're on a slant plane. So we could have a case where we pull out of the material, and well, let's go back to the pin. The pin can fail in shear because the pin is basically in shear where it's held. Of course, these are steel bolts, so it's unlikely that's going to occur. We can have pull out, which would be depending on how this would fail, could involve, if it fails by pulling out along a piece that's the same width as the diameter of the pin, then that would be a shear failure. On the other hand, if the whole piece fails by breaking this part and this part, then that would be a tensile failure in this material. So you can see that we have a number of different types of calculations depending on how this mechanism fails. Now, the other thing we can look at is when this is, turn it around, when this is down like this acts as a beam that's pivoted about here. So I'm pushing down on this so I can generate at this cross section both stresses due to a moment, which would vary with position according to our previous discussions, and also there would be shear forces. So even a device which has relatively simple geometric design can have a variety of different kinds of stress calculations associated with fully analyzing. That concludes our video on stress analysis. Thank you.